Hello and welcome to the fourth week of the Open University's MOOC on Genocide. This week we'll focus on the murder of the Gypsies by Nazi Germany during World War II. We'll briefly review the history of the Gypsies and examine the differences between various Gypsy groups or tribes across Europe. We'll briefly discuss the genocide against the Gypsies in Eastern Europe, where the Nazis slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them. And we'll elaborate on the history of the Gypsy tribe called Sinti that lived for centuries before World War II and in fact still does to this day in German-speaking countries, mostly Germany, Austria and the German areas of Switzerland. We'll try to understand together the interesting dual relationship between the Germans and Gypsies over the centuries. The relations were positive on the one hand, at least in terms of the image of the Gypsies in German society. On the other hand, there was also a negative attitude at the same time within German society for centuries. We'll try to understand why the 19th century brought about a major shift in the gap between German society and the Gypsies. During the week, we'll also talk about one trend in the field of history of ideas, which I find very interesting. The topic we researchers call the Aryan Myths. I'll briefly tell you about the history of this subject that introduced terms like Aryan and Semitic to Western cultural discourse. We'll also study the link between the Aryan myth to the specific story of the Germans and Gypsies. We'll conclude this week with a discussion on the Nazi period from 1933 to the end of World War II. Together, we'll try to understand whether the extermination of the German Gypsies, the Sinti, was indeed a premeditated and intentional plan, or rather, something completely different. As stated, our discussion this week will focus mainly on a very specific group of Gypsies called Sinti. A little background on the Gypsies in general to help us understand the internal dichotomy and division between Gypsy tribes, as well as the commonality and the various issues tying Gypsies across Europe together. The Gypsies, or as they are called in Hebrew, Tzoanim, were thought in Europe to have originated in Egypt. You may know that the city of Tzoan, as mentioned in the Bible, is an Egyptian city. Even in other European languages like English, the word gypsy is actually an etymological distortion of the word Egypt. We see a similar distortion in French, where the Gypsies are called gitans, a distorted pronunciation of the French word for Egypt. This exists in other languages too, suggesting that when the Gypsies arrive in Europe starting in the 15th century, they are a people of nomads migrating from east to west. Soon I'll elaborate about this issue. People across Europe are easily convinced that these strange, dark-skinned folk who speak a foreign language, wear unfamiliar clothing, and wander in small groups through various European countries originated in Egypt. In fact, the Gypsies don't originate from Egypt but from India. Soon I'll elaborate on that too. As far as we know today in modern research, this group of Gypsies originates from northern India, the general area of modern-day Punjab. At a certain point in their history, about 1,000 years ago, though we don't know why and probably never will, the same group of Gypsies leave their homeland, the Punjab area in northern India, and start migrating west. The Gypsies crossed vast territories over a few centuries, advancing through areas of Central Asia near the Indian border, Iran, and eventually arriving by various ways in Eastern Europe. From there, they are able to migrate towards Central Europe and eventually Western Europe. We have written evidence from the 15th and 16th centuries of the appearance of Gypsies almost everywhere in Europe, including German-speaking areas, France, Spain, England, the British Isles, and eventually even further north in Scandinavia. The treatment they get from Europeans is pretty similar in every place. There is quite a lot of written evidence of citizens from various places writing to the local authorities, reporting the arrival of unfamiliar people who speak a different language and whose customs are different from what the Europeans are used to. This is basically how we date back the arrival of the Gypsies in Europe rather accurately. This group that we call Gypsies called themselves another name. They called themselves Roma. Roma is the name of the Gypsy people in their own language called Romani or Romance. The meaning of the word Rom is a person in the Gypsy language, a human being. That is, the Gypsies actually call themselves people, Roma, which I think is nice in itself. The same large groups of Gypsies, generally labeled Roma, is divided into several different tribes that settle in various European territories. Each such tribe, be it in Northern, Southern, Central or Eastern Europe, has a different name. The Roma Gypsy tribe that ultimately settles in German-speaking territories, making it their own migration area, is called Sinti. As stated, this week's discussion will focus on the history of that tribe, the Sinti, and the relations that developed for hundreds of years from the 15th to the 20th centuries between the Germans and the Sinti, who migrate within the German-speaking territories for hundreds of years before reaching an awful peak. These relations deteriorate during the Nazi period and culminate in World War II. In 1943, the Nazi leadership decides to condemn most of the Sinti to death, and nearly half of them are exterminated in Auschwitz. The same group of Gypsies, including the Sinti who live in German-speaking areas and the Romas in general, rarely blend or mixes with the local population it lives with. However, during their wandering from India towards the west, the Gypsies tend to adopt the local religion of the area they eventually settle in. Some Gypsies settle in Muslim territories and indeed took on the Muslim faith. In places where Catholicism is the dominant religion, we see Catholic Gypsies. In places where there are various Protestant churches, we see accordingly the conversion of Gypsies to the Protestant church in order to adapt to the area they settle in. However, we can still see several aspects preserved from the old Hindu customs the Gypsies brought from India, their homeland. For example, the Romani word the Gypsies use for cross, perhaps the most important holy symbol in Christianity, is the same word used by Indian languages from northern India for pitchfork, the holy symbol associated with one of the main gods in the Hindu pantheon, Shiva, the destroyer god who holds a pitchfork. The Gypsies use the same word to describe the Christian crucifix. Even various wedding customs among Roma people across Europe still preserve ancient Hindu customs. Perhaps one more point about this story. For centuries and to this day, Gypsies across Europe rarely marry out of the group. There's an institution of early matchmaking with broad connections across the continent. The Gypsies marry within their own group, sustaining the culture and tradition they've been practicing for many centuries. Even today, they still tend to reject foreign customs they find impure. The foreign Europeans are called Gaggio in Romani, which means impure people. The Gypsies consider themselves, the people, as they put it, as a pure group that mustn't mix with other groups. The Gypsy lifestyle was always that of wandering. In Europe for hundreds of years, since the 15th century, we see the Gypsies maintaining a rather similar lifestyle in different territories, as long as they're allowed to. They usually settle in winter camps during the winter months, especially in the cold German-speaking areas where everything freezes outside for several months a year. They have these encampments where they also keep their livestock. When spring comes and the snow melts, they start a usually predetermined migration route, passing through various stops and setting up all kinds of fairs with sword and fire swallowers or gypsy fortune tellers. You know that generic image. Perhaps one of the biggest European stereotypes of gypsies is the gypsy woman sitting in a tent with a crystal ball and telling people's future for a few cents. Thus, the gypsies live in parallel to European society for hundreds of years. They are perceived as a natural phenomenon across Europe and in German-speaking areas. All in all, it seems that they become part of the natural scenery if I can use that word, of Europe in the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the early modern era, until a certain shift occurs during the 19th century. We'll discuss this shift in the next lecture. That's it for today. Thank you and see you later.